Have you ever spent years thinking about someone, even though they were never really part of your life? Someone you barely knew, yet your mind kept imagining a future with them. Psychologists have a name for this powerful emotional experience. It's called limerence, and for some people, it can quietly steal years of their life. There is a form of emotional pain that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. It happens when someone grows deeply attached, not to a real relationship, but to the idea of a person. This attachment can become so strong that it feels like love, but in reality, the relationship barely exists. Psychologists sometimes call this experience limerence, an intense romantic obsession where someone spends hours imagining a future with a person who is mostly absent from their life. Instead of real interactions, the connection survives inside the mind. People replay tiny moments again and again. A smile, a short conversation, a message on social media. Even silence can become meaningful. Every detail becomes a clue. Every coincidence becomes a sign. Friends may notice the change. They might say things like, "You're not acting like yourself," or "Why are you still thinking about that person?" But when someone is trapped in this emotional state, logic rarely works. The fantasy feels too powerful. And that brings us to a story. To protect privacy, we'll call the woman in this story Elizabeth. Elizabeth wrote a letter asking for advice about a man she couldn't stop thinking about. She described him as charismatic, talented, and extremely successful. For the sake of this story, we'll call him Max. Max had a strong public reputation in his country. He was wealthy, creative, and well known in artistic circles. Because of his status, he rarely trusted new people easily. Elizabeth and Max were not exactly strangers, but they were not close either. They had mutual friends and had crossed paths a few times at social gatherings. They were aware of each other, but they never developed a real friendship. Still, something about him stayed in Elizabeth's mind. At the time, she believed that if she could spend more time with him, something meaningful might develop. Looking back, she admits that she tried a little too hard. She even asked one of their mutual friends to properly introduce them and set them up. But nothing happened. Max never showed clear interest. Years passed. Elizabeth continued living her life, moving through relationships that she later described as unhealthy and chaotic. She struggled with anxiety and self-esteem issues. Her romantic history included several painful relationships that left her feeling emotionally exhausted. Eventually, she stopped thinking about Max as much. Life moved on. Then something unexpected happened. Shortly after Elizabeth ended another relationship, Max suddenly reached out to her on social media. For the first time, he suggested they speak on the phone. For Elizabeth, it felt like destiny was finally knocking. But life rarely follows perfect timing. At that moment, Elizabeth was overwhelmed. She had just gone through a painful breakup, and at the same time, someone in her family had passed away. Her emotional state was fragile and unstable. When Max contacted her, she didn't feel ready to talk, so she politely replied and asked if they could speak another time. She assumed he would follow up later, but he never did. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Eventually, years passed. Max never contacted her again. 4 years went by without a single message. During that time, Elizabeth moved back to her home country after studying abroad. She tried rebuilding her relationship with her mother, hoping things might improve after years of distance. Unfortunately, the situation didn't change much. Her mother remained emotionally distant and difficult, and Elizabeth once again felt the same loneliness she had tried to escape. That's when the thoughts about Max started returning. She began wondering about all the things that could have happened. What if she had answered his call that day? What if she had been in a better emotional state? What if they had met at the right time? These questions slowly turned into a quiet obsession. Elizabeth noticed something strange about her feelings. She didn't truly know Max. They never dated, they barely spoke, and yet she felt emotionally tied to him as if they had shared something profound. Her mind filled in the missing pieces. She imagined the conversations they could have had, the travels they might have shared, the life they might have built together. She convinced herself they had so much in common, both creative, both curious about the world, both thoughtful people. And because of those similarities, she began believing that maybe they were somehow meant to be with each other. But another part of her mind started questioning everything. She asked herself a difficult question. Am I in love with him, or am I just in love with the idea of him? That question is more important than it seems, because love requires two people participating in reality, but limerence survives entirely inside imagination. Elizabeth feared something else, too. She worried that if she let go of the dream of Max, she might never find someone else like him. She described other men she met as boring compared to him. None of them seemed to match the personality she had built in her mind. And that is one of the most dangerous effects of limerence. Real people begin to look dull compared to the fantasy, because real relationships include awkward moments, misunderstandings, imperfections, but imaginary relationships are flawless. They exist in a world where everything feels exciting. And slowly, Elizabeth began to realize something frightening. She might spend the rest of her life waiting for a message that will never come. But the deeper truth was this. This story was never really about Max. It started long before she ever met him. It started in childhood. Elizabeth grew up in a home that looked normal from the outside. There was a house, parents, and the basic structure of family life. But emotionally, things were very different. Her father was distant. He wasn't cruel or abusive. He simply wasn't emotionally present. Conversations were rare. Affection was limited, and he rarely showed interest in what Elizabeth was feeling or experiencing. He existed in the house, but he wasn't truly there. Her mother had another problem. Elizabeth described her as deeply self-absorbed. Everything revolved around her moods, her needs, and her perspective. When Elizabeth tried to express her own feelings, they were often ignored, minimized, or redirected back to the mother. Over time, Elizabeth learned a quiet survival skill. She stopped expecting emotional support. Children raised in these environments often develop an unconscious belief, "My feelings don't matter," or worse, "I have to earn love." When a child grows up without emotional safety, the brain adapts in creative ways. One of the most common coping mechanisms is imagination. If real connection isn't available, the mind creates it. The child begins to dream about someone who will finally understand them, someone who will see them, someone who will choose them. Years later, when that child becomes an adult, those emotional patterns are still active. This is where limerence often begins. When Elizabeth met Max, something about him triggered this hidden pattern. It wasn't just his personality. It wasn't just his creativity or success. It was the fact that he was slightly out of reach. People who grow up with emotionally unavailable parents often feel strangely drawn to emotionally unavailable partners, not because they enjoy pain, but because it feels familiar. The brain recognizes the emotional distance and says, "This feels like home." Max was charming, intelligent, and successful, but more importantly, he was unavailable. That distance gave Elizabeth's imagination the perfect space to grow. Instead of seeing Max as a real person with flaws and imperfections, Elizabeth slowly built a perfect version of him in her mind. In that imagined version, they understood each other deeply, they supported each other's dreams, they shared a life filled with meaning. But none of that existed in the real world. Elizabeth had fallen in love with a story, and stories can feel incredibly real. But eventually she realized something painful. The fantasy wasn't moving forward. Years had passed. Max had not returned. Meanwhile, life around her continued moving forward. Friends built relationships, people grew, changed, and created families. Elizabeth sometimes felt like she was standing still. That realization frightened her, because it forced her to ask a question she had avoided for years. What if the fantasy is the reason my life feels stuck? That question changed everything, because once she faced that truth, she realized something powerful. The emotional energy she had given to Max could have been used to build something real somewhere else. Letting go was not easy. At first, the thoughts kept returning, but slowly, as she stopped feeding the fantasy with attention, the memories lost their power. Elizabeth began focusing on her own life again, her creativity, her friendships, her personal growth. And over time, she discovered something surprising about love. Real love doesn't feel like obsession, it feels like peace. Months later, she met someone new at a creative workshop. There was no dramatic moment, no overwhelming feeling of destiny, just a simple conversation. But something else was present: comfort.